welcome to another episode of the Anti-Agency Podcast, Stories of Doing Business Differently. I'm excited for our guest today. Admittedly, I had the opportunity to be on his podcast. I am a client of his company, and I have been thrilled with my experience. So it was a no-brainer to invite him on the show. I'm excited to talk to him. I'd like to welcome David Nilssen, who's the CEO of Doxa Talent. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. So like I do with all my guests, let's get your story. We're going to talk a little bit about Doxa and what you're doing there and how you disrupt, but just kind of give me your backstory. Like, what were the steps along the way that led you to entrepreneurship, and then ultimately what you're doing today?
Well, leading to entrepreneurship, I'll try and make that one short. I think probably the most influential in that for me was my first job in high school was working for a franchisee, I should say, Subway. So I was, back when they called them sandwich artists, I used to be one of those people helping to deliver happiness through the form of sandwiches and Coke. But I actually at 15 started with them. And by the time I was 17, I was managing 2 locations in Maple Valley, Washington, plus Covington. And I got a chance to actually run somebody else's business and cut my teeth in that regard without having to actually buy it. So I really just enjoyed sort of the nuances of working with customers and developing and training team members. And, I had a lot of fun with it. So I kind of always knew in the back of my mind that I would eventually own my own business. And so that's sort of how I got initially interested in it.
Gotcha. So what were the next few steps that continued your path and ascension towards Doxa?
Yeah. So, I actually started investing in real estate at a very early age. Bought my first property when I was 20 years old. And actually at 21, I started buying up raw lots in Belfair and Bremerton, Washington, because they had reactivated the Navy base due to the war on terror. And I was buying up lots, and we were stripping off the timber, cutting out a pad, bringing up utilities to them, and getting them basically builder ready, and then just flipping those lots. And so I got sort of involved in that. And it's funny because one day I said, well, I think I'm ready to take on some bigger projects, because I was really doing smaller residential lots themselves. And somebody suggested that I raise capital through self-directed IRAs, which was basically using your IRA or 401k to invest in a non-standard asset outside the stock market, but without taking a taxable distribution. I didn't even know you could do that. Yeah. So after learning more about it, I did find that there were people that were there were companies that could allow you to invest your retirement assets in things like private mortgages and tax liens and things like real estate inside your retirement plan. And so long story short, I learned a little bit about that industry, tried to help some people do that by investing in our projects. And as a result of all of that work, ended up launching my own self-directed IRA business in 2003. Wow. Yeah. Which is called Guidant Financial. Today, it's a very, very different company than it was at the time, but we've grown that over the past 2 decades, and that was really where I've spent the last 20 years of my life up until we started Doxa, 3.5 years ago.
Gotcha. So tell the audience a little bit about what Doxa is, and what I'm interested in is what made you decide to jump into that arena.
Yeah. Well, let me actually tell you the backstory that led to that, and I think it'll all sort of tie together. So continuing the thread that we did a minute ago, I started Guidant Financial. Eventually, actually, the business evolved into really a business financing company. So today, it helps thousands of entrepreneurs every year to find capital through things like SBA loans, rollovers for business, startup arrangements, unsecured credit, things like that. The secret in that business, though, is that it actually, we basically, we're helping to finance people at the point that they're acquiring a business, whether they're starting it or buying it, doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. And so we're a trusted influencer at the point of acquisition. And so we are providing, after they've acquired that business with the capital that we've helped them secure, tax and accounting, payroll, and 401k administration services for these small businesses. So today we've got, just under 10,000 people on our platform that are working on these types of things. So while there's a lot of technology available, there's still a lot of human interference that's required in order for us to deliver those services. And if you look at the Seattle area, which is where we started it from 2010 to 2020, that landscape changed dynamically. There's tons of unicorns, a big, vibrant entrepreneurial community. It's really the second Silicon Valley at this point. And it's a very small workforce. So talent scarcity, which we all complain about today, was a major issue for us at the time. And so we started looking at ways to redefine our talent strategy so that we could remain competitive, but manage our costs and so on and so forth. And so we started actually tapping into offshore talent pools as early as 2015. And what we found is that the industry was generally made for large mega employers like Facebook and AT&T who have a high volume of repeatable tasks that they could just outsource to an organization in massive scale. Or there was these mom and pop sort of virtual assistant companies that were trying to tell you that somebody could do your dry cleaning, graphic design, and accounting all in one resource. Neither of those were actually good for us. So we actually found a company that's willing to work with us to hire skilled labor. So software engineers, accountants, sales development, those kind of roles. But work directly with us as an extension of our brand. Ultimately, though, it didn't work very well. And we got a pretty expensive lesson in offshoring. And so we started building a lot of processes and systems on top of the infrastructure. And ultimately, that's what led us to spin it out. What we had created, we thought was something that other entrepreneurs needed. And the pandemic just sort of demonstrated the world got flattened in a minute. People knew they could now work remotely. It was a debate that was happening, but really hadn't been settled. The pandemic forced that hand. And as a result, we decided to productize what we had built and now make it available to small and medium-sized businesses so that we can fill that sort of underserved void in the market.
Yeah, I absolutely love this story. And if you're listening, this is a critical point, is because I very much familiar with what you've experienced. I love this whole idea of like, it's like find a problem and then solve it. In your particular case, what was out there wasn't working for you. So you decided to build the thing that you needed. And now it's turned into a successful business, which is how a lot of businesses and ideas come about. And I can tell you firsthand, I've dealt with that. I've dealt with that frustration of what's been out there. And I totally get what you're saying in terms of that dynamic that it used to be, where it's like, you have your enterprise business and what meets their needs. And then these like small websites that you can jump on and sign up. And for, you sign $70 or $80, you can look at their online directory, cross your fingers and hope that ultimately whoever you get is going to work. And I've tried that for Socialistics. I've tried that in my businesses, and it's failed because it just didn't have that level of sophistication and trust that I knew that who was coming into our world was vetted and we could trust. And I think that's one of the things that was so appealing to me about Doxa, was that it just felt like I didn't have to worry about it. Like I'm spending a little bit more than I might with some of these really cheap options, but you get what you pay for. But it's been effortless, and it works. And what you guys have, it's such a disruption, which I think what you're doing, and it's so exciting. I'm just thrilled to be a client and get to experience that, not only from the benefit of how it impacts our business, but just from the outside looking in, watching this kind of evolve. It's a really, really cool thing to see.
Yeah, I love that. And by the way, it's one of the things that actually really I love about your brand for the podcast, the anti-agency, right? So we actually, when we first started, said we want to be the anti-BPM, right? The traditional model is find the cheapest labor humanly possible, provide them the technology that's, sort of the minimum requirement to get the job done. Don't really invest in their career and their career development. And as a result, the industry standard is 50% turnover every single year, which none of our businesses would survive because of, but they just create this massive machine where they're just churning people out. And so we decided, hey, look, we think there's a way where we can pay them really well in the market, but still have very high expectations, provide them the stability of employment with full benefits and taxes and retirement, but also invest in their career path and their development so that they're, developing as people and professionals. As a result, our last year's attrition was just right at 20%, which is significantly lower than the industry standard. Yeah. And in these types of roles, it's just unheard of. And I think, for us, we're trying to redefine what's best practices and standards in this industry. And we think we can do that in a way where the client can win because they're getting a great worker and a strong cost arbitrage benefit, but the worker is also getting a great employee experience. And we think the combination of those two is what's really exciting.
Yeah, I love that. And that's why I think our companies are really aligned in terms of core values. Like in the agency game, it's also a revolving door. People don't work at agencies for really long times. It's usually a year or two tops before somebody's ready to move on to the next thing. And I just refused to believe in that. This whole anti-agency, thing that I'm doing is we're like, well, how can I build something where people don't leave, where they want to stay? How can I build a culture? How can I treat people the right way so that they want to stick around? I mean, it's tough work and people can get burnt out, but if they fall in love with the company and the culture and what you're doing, and they feel like they're treated well, why can't they stay? Why can't I buck the trend? I don't want that revolving door. And that's a big part of the reason why we're as successful as we are, is because we've been together for so long that we get better at what we do. And it almost becomes just so natural. Everything that we do, the way we interact with each other, the way that we do the work that we do. And ultimately, does it cost a little bit more? Yeah, but we make more. And I think we make more by not having to constantly rehire and retrain. And so I think that's where a lot of business owners can get short-sighted. They're just looking at what's right in front of them in terms of how much am I spending on this thing today, and not thinking about the bigger impact of how, you spend a little bit more right now, but you're going to save so much more in the long run.
It's so funny. Like, oh man, I could geek out with you on this for a long time, because I think, going back to the story where Guidant had a pain point, which we built this internal capability, then created it externally. The internal issue that we were dealing with is that even though we were still growing at a very nice clip, our labor cost, the labor as a percentage of revenue was growing faster than our revenue was. We knew that was not a sustainable trend. Mm-hmm. To your point earlier, though, what we found is that where we were really getting hammered was in turnover. So, here, this company had been named best places to work over, I think, 6 or 7 times. And yet we saw in what I would call our sort of administrative roles, 30% turnover. It was costing us $1 million in terms of time, lost productivity, drain on our people. Like, there was a huge issue associated with that. And now I fast forward to today, and I talk about this all the time. This talent scarcity issue is not going away. Yeah. If you look at population across the world and sort of these, what they're called population pyramids, which if you want to talk about later, we can, that is creating. So right now there's a talent scarcity issue that is only going to get worse. And if you look at why people are leaving, they're leaving first because of lack of career development. Mm-hmm. The second is low pay and benefits. And the third is an uninspiring leader. Yeah. And the good news of all that is we're in control of whether those things are true within our own organizations. Yeah, no, I love that. I think one of the things I've experienced now, we've been in business now for about 6 years, and there's, nothing is absolute, but what I have experienced is a shifting mindset with a large percentage of the workforce in the country. It has gotten harder and harder to get people that have a certain type of work ethic or expectations around what a work week should look like. And look, I am the poster child for work-life balance and for freedom. I mean, I preach it night and day. But one of the risks that I've taken as a business owner when you're that heavy with it is that people can take advantage of that. And then they get used, that becomes their new normal, and they get used to that. And then look, at the end of the day, a business has to make money for it to thrive and to continue to offer those sorts of things. And I've struggled to find people that have the work ethic and the maturity and just perception of what a work week looks like. And I think one of the most refreshing things that I've realized, especially through Doxa, because there are, you get what you pay for. You guys, to me, are like, I feel like you deliver a premium experience, not necessarily at a premium price, but we're getting great people, and they just are awesome. And I think that's one of the misperceptions that a lot of business owners, when they think about offshore talent, they immediately think about language barriers and can they do the same things that we do here? And the reality is that is changing. Like that, and I've witnessed it firsthand based on having worked with someone and what that person has brought to the table. She's a natural extension of our team, and amazing.
And all I'm thinking about is it's changed my way of thinking about how I source my team. I think there's always going to be a level of, look, I have to have some folks in the States and managing some of those client relationships, but there's, 60, 70% of what we're doing, I absolutely could outsource through a company like yours that I know treats those people well and are going to be around and value the opportunity and work their butts off. And it's been an incredible experience.
Yeah, I think the thing that your experience is the new norm, right? I was just looking at data the other day, and there's I think there's close to 9 million open jobs in the US, but there's only 6 million people seeking them.
Yeah.
So look, the supply and demand imbalance is just crazy, right? So you're inviting people into the organization that may not be perfect. There's a skills gap because it's hard to find them, but even still it's competitive. So wage inflation is true and high turnover will remain. And in that environment, it's also harder to find replacements, which puts a disproportionate burden on your people. So like all that stuff is crazy. And I was just, the data point that actually stood out to me is that back in 2010, only 30% of businesses said that they had a hard time finding the right talent. Today, it's 77%. Yeah. So it's a major, major difference. So I think just as a sheer result of that, people have this new openness to international talent pools. Doxa itself, by the way, is a Greek term for changing the belief in something, because we know a lot of people have had bad experiences or they have this bad perception, albeit incorrect, about what talent could look like. And what we've tried to do is build a system that literally is getting the top 1%, because we actually hire less than 1% of the applicants that come through our system, because we have a pretty rigorous filter. Yeah. One funny story I'll tell you, though, that I think people may relate to is that I think there's this perception that going offshore means you're dealing with lower skills, poor English, so on and so forth. One of my partners in the Philippines, first time I met this individual was over a decade ago. I had never been to the Philippines, so I had no idea what to expect. And I met him and I said, wow, where are you from? He said, well, I'm from the Philippines. And I said, well, where'd you go to school? And he said, in the Philippines. And I said, well, where did you learn your English? And he laughed because, the Philippines actually is predominantly an English-speaking country, but I had no idea. Yeah. So English proficiency, as the world has become global, and obviously the English language is a big part of what drives the world economy. Yeah. It's becoming easier and easier to find people that do.
Yeah. One of the most fascinating things that, and I don't know the exact, you can kind of correct me on this, as we were going through the process of working with you guys, it was like this, I kind of knew it, but I didn't really think about it until we were starting to kind of onboard, was the fact that, and I'm pretty sure this is true with all the folks at the Philippines, they work at night, that's their like awake time, and then during the day is when they sleep. It's like, so I'm like, wait a minute, like, because I think a very high percentage of the country's GDP or whatever is reliant on the United or the US's time zones and work that they're doing for them. So that's what they know. And I was like, because I was trying to be really respectful to like, well, what hours can you work and what's okay? Because we kind of need you for these hours. Is that okay? And it was just like, of course it is. I'm like, oh, this is like an aha moment. Like that's what they're used to. But it's crazy because we don't know, right? We have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I think and I don't know these statistics well enough off the top of my head. And frankly, when you're talking about economic statistics in different countries, the data sometimes gets a little squishy, right? But as I understand it, franchising, which is 4,000 brands across the US, accounts for 6% of our GDP. The car industry is less than that. Yeah. But in the Philippines, I've heard stats as high as 18% of GDP is dependent on outsourcing. So it is like, it's an industry that is not even comparable to any industry in the US in terms of its impact on their economy. So as a result, the government has, made massive investments in infrastructure and education to make sure that they continue to lead in that. The BPO industry or business process outsourcing industry runs 24 hours a day. So you'll find that I always joke, there's a happy hour starting every hour of the day because somebody's getting off work. So it literally runs on a 24/7 cycle. So if, about 50% of our workers do work the night shift, which is the daytime for us. Right. The other 50 are generally on a split shift. So there's a little bit of overlap in their schedule, but they can have sort of a normal one. But yeah, you'll find that a lot of families and a lot of couples have built their entire lifestyle around this idea of having, sort of split work shifts. And so even people, I actually at one point had a conversation with one of my team members who I felt they could do the super majority of their work on a split shift, which meant they would work more like a 5 a.m. to 2 p.m. So that we had a little bit of overlap, but they could, have a little bit more of a normal schedule.
Yeah.
They didn't want to. They didn't want to because it didn't work for their family, and they've sort of built their rhythms and sort of family structure around that. So yeah, it is very normal. It's very normal in that particular country. But as we've expanded into different, locales like Kenya and Colombia thankfully has more time zone alignment, but places like Vietnam and Kenya don't necessarily have the same openness to working these overnight shifts.
Sure. So I love asking this question, everybody, because I have my answers to them, but what keeps you up at night? What is it about the business that's your biggest challenge right now? And it's all relative. I don't mean like the entire night. You have good nights. You have every once in a while you have a rough night. But what's the thing that kind of eats away at you that is a big challenge right now for the business that you haven't quite solved yet, perhaps? Yeah.
So I think there's actually three things that come to mind. So I guess I'm extra paranoid. Can't give you one. So the first one is, how do we build better alignment between our customer and our VIP's career development? So, we're the employer and they work with specific clients. We can develop them, but we also want them to be developed in a way that makes sure that they have the right career path with their client, right? And so, that is one challenge. The other that is sort of a part B of that is there's two cultures. We have our own Doxa culture and you have your own socialistics culture. How do we make sure, how do we prioritize which culture is the one that we really lean into? And so I think we're learning as we continue to grow how to sort of better teach what our culture and our expectations are within Doxa, but then also allow them to embrace and really lean into the values of the client as well. So those are two things from the VIP standpoint that keep me up. I don't know if I would say keep me up. Any of these are what I would say keep me up because I'm stressed or anxious, but they're just interesting opportunities or challenges to solve for. And the biggest one is AI. So, I think, when you're in a business that, people right now are running around saying that either AI is, not near as big as people think it is, or it's going to literally take everyone's job. I sit in the middle. I think of AI as this amazing enabling technology to build greater capacity and competency and give us more productivity power. But I think it's still, from my perspective, believe that human interference is still going to be required. I see AI as a great co-pilot for business. So right now what we're doing is we're thinking about and working on ways to leverage AI inside of our business. The easy use cases are like content production, right? So we do a lot of content production. We have a lot of content producers and designers. So, ChatGPT, Midjourney, Jasper, those are all tools that we use regularly. But we actually just announced and will be officially releasing in January that we've made an investment in AI that's going to help us get better talent into our client companies faster using AI as a filtering mechanism. So we engaged an outside firm. We built this tool that effectively will scrape all of the applicants that are coming to our system in real time and compare the application to the job order itself to say, how close a match are these two things? And we've been running it tandem. We've got our sort of what I would call our manual process where our people are the ones doing those filtering. And then we've got this AI sort of co-pilot for purposes of resume filtering next to it. And what we're finding is that it's performing as good or better through the AI tools. The good news is this year we processed over 60,000 applications. Now the tool will tell us which of the 4,000 or 5,000 are the people we really should be spending our time with, which again means that we can deploy those people in different areas of the business. So it's created greater capacity and it's going to provide a better customer experience, both for the VIP entering them into the organization because it'll be faster, and for the client to get better talent faster as well. So that's an example, something that's keeping us up at how we're thinking about something.
I love it. And the AI thing is so tight. I'm knee deep in immersing myself into all things AI. A lot of that was stemmed from my recent participation in this startup event from Pegasus Ventures, because I was surrounded by just all of these amazing startups and a lot of them around AI. And I came back and just immerse myself in, okay, I need to figure out how can I leverage this for myself. And that was about a month ago. And so I'm going to have podcast episodes and blog posts to speak to this more depthly, but at a high level. I agree with you. I'm in the middle. I think it's an amazing tool. It is not going to replace human beings. All it's going to do is allow us to do more and be more efficient and allow us to spend time on the things that are more human. And to me, that's like, strategy and creativity and those sorts of things. And that's how I've been using it, training custom GPTs to better mimic my voice so that when I give it ideas, what the output is a little bit farther along than maybe it might be if you're just generically asking it, generic prompts and whatnot. And that's where it's interesting. And this is what I'll be speaking to a lot over the course of the years for people that think that it's going to replace people's jobs. It's not. And the reality is, especially in the agency game, the people that are hiring us don't want to do anything, period. End of story. It doesn't matter if AI makes our jobs 20, 30, 40% more efficient. They still don't want to figure out how to use it and how to leverage it strategically. They still need somebody to help them navigate that. So it's on me, our agency, to learn those tools and to use them responsibly and mirror that with a human element. So I totally agree. And then it's fascinating to me how fast, and it almost feels like the machines are learning and they're all going to rise up. But I mean, it is the speed at which it is evolving is remarkable in terms of what it can and can't do. And I can't even fathom, where it's going to be another year or two from now. But yeah, your use case is perfect, right? I mean, it just allows you to be more efficient, to find more great people, and then have people focus on things that, are have more of a human element to them.
Yeah, I think it'll change people's roles. It'll change expectations. Yeah. There's, like the whole talent landscape as a result of what's happening in the talent scarcity, remote work, culture, and then AI is going to be a very dynamic place. But, I look back at some of the major technological innovations that occurred over the last 500 years, the printing press, the electric light bulb, the combustion engine, the television, internet, IoT, social media, you name it. And there was always like a discussion around like, is this going to completely decimate these different industries? And in some cases, definitely the industries, the current leading industries were impacted. But as a result of these new technologies, more jobs were created, more capacity was created. So I'm still, I would say, on the human potential positive side of this whole debate. Yeah,
no, I agree. I think it's just on people to educate themselves and figure out what, these new opportunities are going to look like. And even with me, in just a short time, I was able to learn so much in just a couple of weeks about how to leverage these tools in the right way. And then to your point, now I start thinking, okay, how can we leverage this in our business responsibly? And I think that's the key. I mean, if people think that they're just going to ask ChatGPT and write them a blog post and then you just publish that, well, that's not going to end up working, because it's just, as time goes on, people can see through that. You can tell something that hasn't been edited or massaged or had a human element added to it. So I think, people, it's just like anything else. It's a tool, and you have to learn how to use it responsibly.
There's always going to be a need for authenticity. Yeah. That's the way that I see it. So
no, absolutely. So just in the industry as a whole, I've always been passionate about hiring and recruiting and mentoring. So obviously there's just a general, interest personally in what you're doing and how you're doing what you're doing. What do you see? What does the future look like in terms of what you're doing? I know we talked a little bit about AI, so that's a no-brainer, but how do you see the landscape of businesses and how they hire, and what's that going to look like, 5-10 years from now?
Yeah, there's so many what I would call debates that are happening inside of the talent landscape. Mm-hmm. So the first one is talent scarcity a temporary issue, or is it here to stay? Mm-hmm. The second is, should I be a remote employer, a hybrid employer, or an in-office employer? The third is, should I be all American, or should I be international and a global workforce? And then the fourth, I should say, is really around culture. And so maybe I could take a second and just walk you through how do I think about these things. So first, on the talent scarcity side, if you look at birth rates from 1950 to today, they are in decline in nearly every single country across the world. And that's just as a result of globalization, industrialization. People went from farming into these urban centers, And as a result of that, they stopped having children. Children are great when you're farming because they're free labor. But when you move into the city, all of a sudden they become an expense and you start having fewer and fewer and fewer. And you saw this actually, there was this huge social media sort of buzz around the North Korean leader who begged people to start having more children because their economy is in decline and cannot grow because their population pyramid has gone from the older workforce is replaced by a larger, younger workforce to an inverted pyramid where the population is shrinking and the workforce that is replacing those that are aging out is smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's happening across almost every first world country. And so as a result, talent scarcity simply will be an issue for decades in the future. If you believe that's true, then the workforce debate or the workplace debate becomes really interesting. Because right now, I saw this statistic the other day that 50% of companies want their team members in the office 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. But I just did a social media survey on my LinkedIn profile, and it confirmed only 4% actually want to be in the office that often. So there's this huge debate between what do I do? And I believe that COVID showed us that, one, the world got flattened in an instant. We can actually work and be productive in a remote environment. But I'm actually a fan of being in the office or out of the office. It's the hybrid environment that I think is dangerous because you pay for both. But you can't be best in class in either. So Doxa decided, look, we believe talent scarcity is an issue. We need to be able to access new international labor pools. So we have to be a remote employer so everybody has a consistent experience and we're best in class at that. Yeah. And then the final one is how do you build culture? And when you're in an office, it's easy. That's through osmosis, right? Like sit next to, Jason and learn from him. And 2 weeks later, you'll figure it out. You can't be sloppy in a remote environment. So you have to really define those. And for us, we define those connection. So it's connection to the purpose, connection to the leader, connection to the client, connection to the community. If we can do those 4 things and do that very intentionally, then we win as an employer. So to me, those are the big things. And the AI is really just how we amplify our efforts. But those are the sort of key components that I think are really interesting.
It's been interesting. I launched my business a year before COVID hit. So we were remote ahead of it. That just doubled down on it. So we don't know anything else. I think going into it, I thought at some point, there'd be a physical office involved, but that ship has sailed. I personally think that companies that are holding on to this old school thinking around, I need butts and seats, is really more about power and or the investments they've made in real estate that they need to justify, things that ultimately aren't about our what's best for the company in terms of output and results. Because every study that you see, shows predominantly that people are more productive remotely. That's not to say that it's, 100% by any means, but it's not about that. It's about these ancillary things. And I think those things are going to work themselves out. I think, the advent of AI, the advent of augmented reality, virtual reality, I think once Apple's new device comes out next year and it starts overlaying, and I think we're going to start being in the office, but not being in the office. Like I think, 20 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to be wearing these things and you're going to be in an office, but at home, and we're going to think what we were doing was so archaic. So it's an inevitable path, I think. Yeah. So that's why I love what you guys are doing. I think, you're ahead of the game. You're doing something that I think ultimately people are just going to continue to embrace. And a lot of that has to do with just changed perceptions about, what work needs to look like. And to your point, culture is tough. I've for the past 6 years, I've been trying to, how do we build a culture remotely? And we're doing some cool things. We're using a platform called Kumo Space, which is like this virtual real office that we've fallen in love with. And it's like this blend of like, we're in the office, but it's virtual, but you can walk into people's offices, you can design your office. It's so interesting, but it takes work. Like as a company, you have to prioritize, I believe, a future role. Somebody's going to be like remote culture specialist or director of remote culture or something like that, because it's a lot of work and it takes consistency. So you have to invest in that.
Yeah, it's so funny. I love that you bring up, hey, look, the future is remote, right? And everything happens gradually and then suddenly. That's just the idea of the exponential curve, right? It's sort of creeping up on us right now. And a lot of people just feel like they can fight the trend. The trend is that ship has sailed. The train has left the station. People need to get on board. What you described though a minute ago is exactly why I'm a big fan of in the office or out of the office, but not in the center. Because in the center, you actually create two classes of employees, right? One of the reasons, in addition to all the things you said around real estate and some of the prior business, disciplines or practices, is that in a in-person environment, you can do management by sight. I can see you're working, Jason. I know that you're doing your job, but you have to go management by objective when you're in a remote environment. That is a very different muscle and skill set. It's hard to make that transition. But the two classes of employee is really important because you default to what's easiest. So as a manager, I can manage you well when you're in the office, but if you're remote, we'll figure it out. We'll do it ad hoc. I don't have the same discipline. It's just really hard to do that. And it took one experience for me when we had decentralized our organization at Guidant. We had a Boise office and a Guidant office. So we used to do these Zoom calls where everybody was in a room sort of talking to each other. One time I was traveling, and so I just zoomed in and I was sort of, in the clouds above them, cyber stalking the conversation. And I realized at that point that I was out of sight, out of mind. And it was a totally different customer experience for me, even as the CEO. And I said, listen, from now on, if one person's remote, everyone goes remote. Everyone's on the same playing field, using the same tools, communicating the same way, having the same experience. Otherwise, it will just be inconsistent, and that is not great.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to ask you one more question before we wrap things up, and it's a tough one. So hopefully you don't have a problem answering it. But I know the answer to this. I have an answer to this, but I'm curious how you would, and you may be getting this question or dealing with it as a CEO of a company that has outsourced talent. What do you say to folks or business owners that think or are really pro-America? My jobs need to be in the States. I'm not going to outsource anything. Kind of like this negative thought of outsourcing work and how that is a bad thing, and you should be rewarding the people that live in the country and et cetera. Do you come across those sorts of opinions? It's possibly you don't, because people that feel that way are so, black and white about how they see things. But I'm curious if you do or how you deal with that sort of perspective.
Yeah, it's a fair one. And look, I'm pro-America as well, but I also believe that we are a globally connected world, and that we have to embrace. We can't buck every trend. At the end of the day, though, if I look at my own experience at Guidant, so let me just take Doxa out of the picture for a second. Mm-hmm. And 2016 is when we started this sort of journey, right? 2015 is when we started to explore, but 16 is when we really started to lean in. 2016, I had 125 people in downtown Bellevue, Washington. Mm-hmm. In 2020, we had still had a total of 125 people in the U.S., but 12% of them were remote and 14% of them were offshore. So we had added 20 people offshore to that. Mm-hmm. And you fast forward to where it was at the end of 2022, we had 130 people in the US and 80 people remote. So we didn't lose any jobs. In fact, we created jobs over that period of time. Yeah. We also, though, were able to invest heavily in building additional capacity. What's interesting, though, Jason, what happened is that we had to hire or elevate more supervisors, more managers, and more trainers as a result. So we actually created more opportunity for our people onshore as a result of going offshore. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what people need to just be open to, is that this is not a cost-cutting exercise. Yes, it creates cost efficiencies, but if people do this right, it should be a growth strategy, not an efficiency campaign. Yeah,
no, that's exactly what I was going to say. I certainly, as a business owner, I've benefited from cost savings per se. But to your point, it's positioning us to be able to grow and be more efficient. And here's the most important thing that I think is really cool about this. It's allowed me to evolve roles in my company in a way that I couldn't before. So when I talked about folks, that revolving door, well, look, people, after a year or two or three, people want to be promoted. They want to take on added responsibilities. But if I don't have a system in place to create that hierarchy, they're going to leave, and not necessarily for bad reasons. So this, being able to kind of bring folks in and outsourcing talent and having them come in and take on some of these responsibilities has put me in a position to make the roles that I currently have, evolve them, give them opportunities to do other things that now lets me hold on to these people for longer. So there's a lot of, it's not a black and white issue. And I think that people that look at that and say, oh, I'm not going to do it, like they're not thinking like a true business owner should, in terms of the impact that it can have. And to your point, there's tons of jobs and not enough people to fill them. There's a lot of people that don't want to do certain things anymore. And then there's a line out the door in other countries where there's qualified, amazing people that are willing to do it and do it with a smile on their face. And that has certainly been my experience working with you guys. So I love the direction that we're headed and really excited about what you guys are building, because I know that we're going to stand to benefit from that for quite some time. So awesome. So but before we wrap up, my guess is folks that are listening to this are business owners. They've probably been piqued. Where and how can they find you and get the process started if they're interested in learning more about working with you guys?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the company's website is Doxa Talent. It's DOXA talent.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn at just David Nilssen. That's my handle.
Awesome. And we will put those links in the show notes. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly, highly, highly recommend checking them out. If you run a service-based business or any sort of business, they're incredible. I've nothing but great things to say. So, David, thank you so much for being on the show, and awesome conversation as I expected, and look forward to working with you guys for a long time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. This was a fun conversation. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. That's it for this week's episode of Anti-Agency Stories of Doing Business Differently. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Tell your friends. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.